The rain was relentless that night, pouring over the city, like it wanted to wash away every trace of the poor. Armin stood outside the university gate, clutching a torn envelope of unpaid tuition bills. He hadn't eaten for 2 days, and the streetlights blurred through his tears. That's when a black limousine stopped beside him. A window rolled down, and an elderly woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes looked at him. "You remind me of someone I once loved," she said softly. "Would you marry me?" Armin laughed. At first, he thought it was a cruel joke. But when she handed him a check worth more than his entire future, his laughter died. 7 days later, he would stand in the same mansion, trembling, staring at something so shocking that it would change everything he believed about life, love, and the meaning of loyalty. And in that moment, he realized some blessings come disguised as sins, and some sins come wearing a wedding ring. Love or survival? The unlikely marriage. The world has a cruel way of testing those who dream. Armin was one of those dreamers, a 24-year-old university student with more hope than luck, more debt than food, and more scars than stories. His shoes had worn through at the heels. His textbooks were secondhand, and his pride, the only thing left untouched, was slowly collapsing under the weight of unpaid tuition and hungry nights. Every day he stared at his classmates who drove imported cars, wore designer watches, and complained about exams while sipping overpriced coffee. Armin, on the other hand, was counting coins for his next meal. He had come to the city from a small village, chasing the promise that education could change his destiny. His mother had sold her wedding bangles to send him to university, whispering, "You are our only hope." Those words echoed in his mind each night as he lay awake in his rented room, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if hope was just another luxury he couldn't afford. When his scholarship was cut off, and the university threatened suspension over unpaid fees, Armin reached the edge of despair. He had tried everything: tutoring kids, working nights in restaurants, even skipping meals to save money. But nothing was enough. Poverty, like a stubborn shadow, never left his side. It was on a cold, rain-soaked evening that fate decided to intervene. Armin stood outside the campus gate, clutching a bundle of papers that now meant nothing, a dropout notice. His vision blurred between tears and rain. He felt invisible in a world that only bowed to power and money. That's when a sleek black limousine pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down slowly, and he saw her. Margaret Whitmore, 71 years old, wrapped in elegance and grace. Her silver hair glimmered under the streetlight like moonlight against night. Her face, though lined by time, carried the dignity of someone who had lived through everything life could throw. But her eyes, sharp, calm, knowing, they had the kind of sadness that wealth could never heal. She looked at him for a moment longer than comfort allowed, then spoke in a voice soft yet commanding. "You remind me of someone I once loved." Armin thought she was mistaken, maybe delusional. He mumbled an apology and turned to walk away, but she continued, "If I offered to change your life tonight, would you let me?" Her words froze him in place. He turned back, half curious, half offended. "What do you mean?" he asked. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling slightly, as if carrying both pain and power. "Marry me." For a moment, he thought she was joking. A rich old woman playing a cruel game with a poor boy's dignity. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. But when her driver stepped out and handed him a folded check, his laughter vanished. The amount written was more than his entire university fees, more than what his family could ever earn in a lifetime. He stared at the paper, then at her, unable to speak. Margaret looked at him, not with arrogance, but with a strange compassion that unsettled him. "You need help. I need something money cannot buy. Maybe we can help each other." May her proposal haunted him that night. He couldn't sleep. His mind wrestled between pride and survival. What kind of man would marry a 71-year-old woman for money? But what kind of son would watch his mother suffer while he clung to pride? The rain outside whispered temptation, and the hunger in his stomach spoke louder than his conscience. By morning, his decision was made. When Armin arrived at her mansion, it felt like stepping into another world. Marble floors, chandeliers, paintings older than his country. The servants looked at him with quiet disgust, the world's judgment embodied in their eyes. But Margaret greeted him warmly, offering tea like an old friend, rather than a stranger about to become her husband. "Do you think I'm crazy?" she asked him, smiling faintly. Armin hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think," he said finally, "you're offering something I don't understand." Their marriage was quiet, almost secret. No guests, no celebration, just a legal document and a strange silence between two souls who had nothing in common except loneliness. The world would never understand. The newspapers would call it scandal. His classmates would call it madness. But Armin didn't care anymore. All he saw was his mother's face when he told her she would never have to worry again. Yet as he stood beside Margaret during the small ceremony, something inside him felt uneasy. He couldn't explain it. A weight, a question, the sense that this wasn't what it seemed. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the ring on his finger, and for a brief second, he saw tears in her eyes. Not tears of joy, but of something deeper, regret, or perhaps guilt. After the ceremony, as they sat in silence, Margaret said softly, "Everyone thinks money buys freedom, but it often buys the opposite. Sometimes, Armin, the richest people are those who have nothing left to lose." He didn't understand then, but those words would follow him for the next 7 days, leading him to the discovery that would shake his soul and unravel the truth behind the woman he had married for survival. The mansion of silence. Secrets hidden behind wealth. The first time Armin stepped into Margaret's mansion, it felt less like entering a home and more like walking into a museum of ghosts. Every corner of the vast estate breathed history. Portraits of forgotten faces lined the walls. Marble statues watched silently from the corners, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender mixed with loneliness. The chandelier above him shimmered like captured starlight. Truth, yet the silence underneath it was so deep it almost hummed. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from stories buried too long. Margaret guided him through the halls with a quiet grace, her steps slow but steady. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice carried a haunting calmness. "This house has seen more than it should," she said softly as they passed an old piano covered in dust. Every sound echoes a memory. Armin didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, pretending not to notice how her eyes lingered on certain rooms longer than others, especially a door at the end of the west wing, locked with a heavy brass key. In the first few days after their marriage, Armin tried to adjust to his new life, but wealth was not as comforting as he had imagined. The mansion was enormous, yet it felt smaller each day, shrinking around him with invisible eyes watching from the shadows. The servants were polite but distant, always whispering when he entered the room. Some wouldn't even meet his gaze. Once, he caught the head maid staring at him with an expression that was almost pity. He wanted to ask why, but the moment he did, she turned away, murmuring, "You should not ask too many questions, sir." At night the silence grew heavier. The ticking of the antique clock in the hallway echoed like a heartbeat, and sometimes, in the stillness between midnight and dawn, Armin swore he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing outside his room. The first time it happened, he thought it was just his imagination, a byproduct of fear and uncertainty. But the second night, when the footsteps paused right outside his door, and he heard a faint whisper. His name, spoken almost tenderly. He knew he wasn't dreaming. He opened the door instantly, heart racing. But the hallway was empty, the air still cold. Margaret was a mystery to him. She spoke little of her past, though her eyes often betrayed the weight of unspoken memories. Sometimes, he would find her sitting by the grand window in the drawing room, staring at the garden beyond, where wilted roses leaned toward the earth, as if grieving. "Do you ever get lonely here?" he once asked, sitting a few steps behind her. She smiled faintly without turning her head. "Truth. You don't get lonely when you've already lost everyone you loved." Her words hit him harder than he expected, filling the room with a sadness that lingered long after she left. On the third day, curiosity began to gnaw at Armin. He wandered through the mansion's endless corridors, discovering rooms filled with relics of a different era. A study lined with rare books, a gallery of paintings that seemed to follow his every move, and a nursery filled with toys covered in dust. A small rocking horse stood in the center of the room, its paint chipped and its saddle torn. There was something unbearably tragic about it. He noticed a framed photo on a shelf. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, smiling beside a younger Margaret. The boy's eyes were the same sharp blue as hers. That night, Armin couldn't sleep. The image of the boy haunted him. Who was he? Why did the servants avoid that part of the house? The question burned in his mind, yet every time he thought about asking Margaret, something in her expression warned him not to. On the fourth day, he found himself standing in front of the locked door at the West Wing again. It was different from the other rooms. No dust on the handle, no cobwebs around the frame. Someone had been entering it. But who? He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the wood. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, he heard something. Not a voice, but the sound of something being moved, like a chair scraping the floor. When he stepped back, his heart pounding, he realized Margaret was standing at the end of the hallway, watching him. She didn't look angry, only deeply, heartbreakingly sad. "There are places in this house," she said quietly, "that should remain locked. Promise me you won't go there." Armin nodded, but curiosity refused to die. The following days passed with an uncomfortable rhythm. Margaret grew distant, spending long hours in her study with the door closed. When Armin brought her tea one evening, he noticed papers scattered across the desk, letters, some faded, others torn at the edges. He caught a glimpse of one name, repeated several times, before she quickly covered it with her hand. Andrew. When she saw his puzzled expression, she forced a smile. "My son," she said simply. "He's been gone a long time." The word "gone" lingered like smoke. Gone, not dead, not alive. Just missing from the world in some unexplainable way. That night, as Armin lay awake again, he realized the mansion was not a place of comfort, but a monument of grief. Its walls held secrets older than his desperation, and its silence wasn't peace. It was the echo of unfinished stories waiting to be uncovered. The test of truth, 7 days of revelation. By the 5th day, the mansion had begun to feel less like a home, and more like a labyrinth of questions that had no answers. Truth. Armin could no longer ignore the whispers that followed him down the corridors, or the feeling that something was deliberately being kept from him. Margaret's behavior, too, had shifted. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. She would wake up earlier than usual, spend hours alone in the locked West Wing room, and sometimes, when she came out, her eyes would be red, as though she had been crying. When Armin asked if she was all right, she would simply smile, place a hand on his cheek, and whisper, "You remind me more of him every day." Those words, spoken with such emotion, both comforted and terrified him. Who was this person she kept seeing in him? The more he tried to make sense of things, the more the mansion seemed to resist him. On the 6th morning, Armin followed one of the maids to the garden, hoping for some straight answers. But the maid, a timid woman in her 40s, looked pale at the mention of the West Wing. "Don't ask questions about that room, sir," she said in a low, trembling voice. "Not everyone who opens that door comes out the same." Her words weren't a threat. They were a warning, soaked in fear and experience. Armin walked away unsettled, yet the curiosity burning in him had become unbearable. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, he decided he could no longer ignore it. He needed to know the truth. He moved quietly through the halls, the sound of his own heartbeat louder than his footsteps. When he reached the West Wing, the air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The door loomed before him, ancient and heavy, with that same brass lock. He hesitated for a long time, his conscience warring with his fear. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something. The faint glint of a key, lying on the small table nearby. It was as if the house had offered it to him. His hand trembled as he picked up the key. When he inserted it into the lock, the sound of the latch clicking open echoed down the hallway like thunder. Inside, the room was dark and cold. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wilted flowers. Armin stepped inside, lighting the small lamp he carried. As the glow spread, the room came to life, and what he saw froze him where he stood. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Some framed, some pinned, some scattered across the floor. The same boy from the photo in the nursery appeared again and again, smiling, playing, growing older in each image, until the photos stopped abruptly when he was about Armin's age. On a nearby table lay stacks of letters, their ink faded but still legible. He picked one up, his hands shaking as he read the first line. "Dear Mother, I forgive you for everything." The rest of the letter was smudged with what looked like tears. Then he saw something else, a medical file, its cover marked with the name, Andrew Whitmore. Inside were hospital records, psychological reports, and finally, a death certificate. The date was 10 years ago. Cause of death: suicide. Armin felt the blood drain from his face. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Margaret's son had died young. The same age, the same face, even the same dark hair and build as his own. Suddenly, her strange affection, her sorrowful gazes, her cryptic words, they all made sense. To her, he wasn't just a poor student she had rescued. He was a living shadow of the son she had lost. But there was more. Beneath the file was a small wooden box, its lid carved with initials AW. Inside were a wedding ring, a folded photograph, and a sealed letter with his name written on it. Armin. His breath caught. How could this letter have his name when it was dated before he ever met her? His fingers trembled as he opened it. The letter was written in Margaret's handwriting. "If you are reading this, it means I have finally found someone worthy of the truth. I didn't marry you out of need or madness. I married you to give you what I could not give my son. A chance to live, to be seen, to be loved without conditions. You will think me cruel for the secrets I kept, but I needed to see whether you would love a broken woman without judgment, or if you too would be swallowed by greed and pity. Everything you see around you, the house, the fortune, even my trust, are not gifts, they are tests." Armin dropped the letter, his heart racing. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed, pitied, or honored. He turned to leave but found Margaret standing in the doorway. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her. Fragile, trembling, but calm. "You were never supposed to find that yet," she said softly. Her voice broke with emotion. "But perhaps it's time, you know. Everything I did, every word, every silence, it was to see if you were like everyone else who saw me as a prize or a curse." Armin tried to speak, but no words came. He wanted to scream, to demand why she had deceived him. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw something deeper than deception. He saw a mother's grief, a woman who had spent years trying to rewrite the ending of her greatest regret. She walked toward him slowly, her fingers brushing against the photographs on the wall. "I thought I could never feel again," she whispered. "But the moment you walked into my life, something changed. Maybe it wasn't you I was meant to save. Maybe it was myself." The silence that followed felt sacred, heavy with emotion and truth. The storm outside rattled the windows, and Armin realized the world, beyond the mansion, would never look the same again. The real inheritance. The meaning of love and redemption. The morning after the truth unraveled. The mansion no longer felt haunted by Armin. It felt human. The silence he once feared was now filled with an unspoken understanding between him and Margaret. They sat across from each other in the grand dining hall, where the sun filtered softly through tall windows, painting golden light across the table that separated two lives once divided by years, class, and circumstance. The servants moved quietly, their usual suspicion replaced by something gentler. Even they could sense that something had shifted, not in wealth or position, but in the air that surrounded them. Margaret looked weaker that morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, and her face seemed paler, her strength fading like a candle in its final hours. Yet there was a light in her eyes, not of wealth or power, but of release. For the first time since their marriage, she seemed at peace. Armin watched her silently, the words from the letter still echoing in his mind. "Everything you see around you, the house, the fortune, even my trust, they are not gifts. They are tests." He understood it now. The entire marriage, every moment of confusion and doubt, had been Margaret's final attempt to find redemption. Not for herself alone, but for her son. Truth, whose memory she had carried like a wound that never healed. He wanted to hate her for the deception, for making him a pawn in a game of grief. But the more he looked at her fragile frame, the more he saw not a manipulative millionaire, but a lonely mother trying to make peace with her past. "Why me?" he asked finally, his voice breaking the heavy quiet. "Why did you choose me? Out of all the people in the world?" Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze distant, as if seeing through time. "Because you had nothing," she whispered. "And yet, when I looked into your eyes that night, I saw everything I lost: kindness, hunger, pain, hope. You reminded me that love isn't born out of perfection. It's born out of struggle." Her words struck him deeply. For so long, Armin had seen love as a privilege of the rich, a luxury that only those with comfort could afford. But here, sitting across from this dying woman, who had known every form of loss imaginable, he realized that love, true love, was not about possession or age or appearance. It was about two broken souls finding a reflection of their pain in each other. Over the next few days, Margaret began to open up more, speaking of things she had never told anyone. She told him about Andrew, how he had been brilliant and kind, but fragile, how he had fallen into depression after losing his father, how wealth had suffocated him rather than saved him, and how she, in her pride, had ignored his silent cries for help. "Money can build walls," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "but it can't keep out guilt." Armin listened, feeling the rawness in her confession, the years of silence that had turned into poison inside her. He began to see her not as a symbol of luxury, but as a woman still paying for the mistakes of love unspoken. On the seventh day, Margaret called him into the study. The same desk where he had once seen the mysterious letters was now neatly organized. A document lay open, sealed with her signature. "This is my final will," she said softly. "I'm leaving everything to you." Armin's eyes widened in disbelief. "No, he said instantly, shaking his head. I can't accept that. I didn't marry you for money. Margaret smiled gently, a tear rolling down her wrinkled cheek. I know, she replied. That's why you deserve it. You've already passed the test. But Armin refused to take the pen she held out. You don't understand, he said. I came here lost and desperate. You gave me more than money could ever buy. You gave me back my dignity. His voice cracked as he spoke, the emotions he had buried finally rising to the surface. If I take your fortune, I'll lose the only thing I have left, the truth of what we've shared. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Then promise me one thing, she whispered. Don't let this house die with me. Fill it with life again. Let laughter echo where silence once lived. That will be your real inheritance. That night, Margaret fell ill. The doctors came and went, their faces grave, their words formal. Armin stayed by her bedside, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. At one point she opened her eyes and looked at him with a faint smile. You know, she said weakly, I used to think love was something that ended when youth did. But now I know. Love only ends when the heart forgets how to give. Armin couldn't respond. His throat was tight with emotion. He simply squeezed her hand and stayed until dawn, when the first light crept through the curtains, for the rhythmic sound of her breathing faded into silence. After the funeral, Armin walked through the mansion alone. It no longer felt cold. The same halls that once frightened him now carried a warmth that came from memory, from shared laughter, late night conversations, and quiet forgiveness. He found the letter she had written him still folded on her bedside table. At the end of it, one line stood out, written in delicate cursive: wealth fades, love remains, and redemption is the only inheritance worth receiving. Armin stood there for a long time, the morning light glimmering through the window, illuminating the portrait of Margaret and her son that hung above the fireplace. He looked at it one last time, realizing that the old woman, who had once seemed like a mystery, was, in truth, a mirror, reflecting the lesson he had been too blind to see all along.